Good morning, everybody. Today we are moving into Unit 7. Unit 7 will cover 2 chapters. With any luck, we can get through all of this today. That's kind of my hope, and we're going to be learning 2 really cool new things today. So the big topics for the day are working with forms, and those are user interface elements or user controls that we add to web pages and graphical applications in order to interact with our users. And we're also going to look at adding multimedia to our websites, and that includes audio and video. And I think that both of those topics are pretty exciting. We're going to take them one at a time, so we're going to start out with Chapter 9, which talks about forms. So we are going to be doing kind of a little bit of lecture and demo kind of at the same time, so I'm going to be demonstrating the concepts as we go. And then hopefully you guys can follow along. So one of the assignment requirements that you're going to see in here is that you're going to have one assignment where you add a form to your website that you're working on, and another assignment where you add multimedia to your website. And you can do these both a few different ways, but once again, the goal here is every time I say like add a form to your site or add multimedia to your site, you're kind of building your final project as you go, and you're adding to it. All right, so I do have the PowerPoint up on screen here already, and let's go look at what our topics are for this. So we're going to look at how forms are used on web pages and why they're important and what they're used for, more importantly. And we're going to use them on kind of a primitive level and then show you some of the higher level features that come with them and how to create custom forms, field sets, image buttons, and how forms kind of work. We're also going to work a little bit on styling those forms so we can make them look more than what the default HTML elements generate. And then look at some of the new features that are featured with HTML5. There was a pretty big advancement when we switched to HTML5 in terms of what forms can do natively, which is really cool. A lot of new features, some of them kind of eliminating the need for external scripting in order to make certain things work, which is really nice. And we'll talk a little bit about this concept of server-side processing and what that even means, because so far we've been working on what they call the client side, which is in the browser. So whenever we say client side, when we talk about web work, it always refers to what the user interacts with within their browser. All right. So let's talk about what a form is. And I know like in the previous class, I did this. Right? I brought up Facebook and I kind of bring it up as an example here, because right when we land on their page and we talked about this, right, you're given the option to do what? You're either logging in or signing up, or option number 3 is get the hell out, right? I came here by accident. Not likely, but, and I think this is fascinating. I saw a stat yesterday that said that Facebook has an active 987 million active daily users. Not like every other day. Every day, they've got almost 1 billion people that log into this website. That's crazy. That's 1 out of every 8 people on the planet. So the ones that don't have Facebook pages are either like little kids, or really old people, or people in places where they just don't have it, or IT people. That's the other commonality. But when we come to this page, when we get the option to either sign in, now they have this like graphical tile thing, but up here, do you notice how they have these boxes where you can type in your email address and your password, and then a button? Those are form elements. Text boxes, right, where you type, labels that describe them, and buttons that trigger the form to operate. All right? When you go to sign up, same thing, right? They have here boxes. You notice how I didn't type anything in and it turned red, right? Because, hey, don't you want to type something in there? You want to join, don't you? Right? But once again, text boxes, these have a little different approach. These have a label that sits outside of it. This has information inside of it. And then we also have like these little drop-down boxes, right? And then we also have the what we call radio buttons here, right? Ma- Wait, I guess I never noticed this. Female, male, custom? Okay, I'm a custom gender. All right. Welcome to the future, folks. And then you got the big button that allows you to sign up. But these are kind of like real common form elements. So these are the kind of things that we're building. So when we talk about forms are used all over the web, they are. Almost every website that has some sort of a login at the very least, or if you're doing any sort of e-commerce, any time you're interacting with the website, beyond just clicking on a link, typically you're interacting with some sort of a form element. So forms become a primary way for users to interact with web applications. Here's a tip. Forms are also the primary way for users to interact with standard applications as well. So we have Windows Forms applications, and you'll learn how to do forms in like Java, and you can do them in Python, and just about any language or development environment, forms are kind of a thing. So that's why it's really important for HTML. And now, since most of our online, applications or mobile apps tend to be web-based, this really makes them very important. So what do you use forms for? Well, searching, right? So I guess like Google is like a big form, right? They have a text box you type into, you click search. To do orders, newsletters, sign-ups, surveys, add to cart, etc. So a lot of different ways. You guys probably use forms on a daily basis on most websites you go to. You don't even think about it. Anytime you're logging in or clicking a button, you're interacting with the form. So that's why this is a very important chapter. So we actually have one core HTML tag called form that actually holds the entire form within an HTML page. So when I will put a form tag on a page, its job is to hold all the stuff inside that form. So what you're seeing on the screen there is kind of a complete form. They have, shipping address entry. They got name, company, address, city, state, zip code, country, a couple of buttons at the bottom, and everything inside that box is considered a form element. Whether it's a label or a drop-down box or whatever it is, those are all considered form elements. All of them accept information. And the important thing here is when a form collects information and you hit that button, we're expecting it to take that information and send it somewhere. And where it sends it to is called the server that processes the form somehow and does something with it. All right. Now, it's important for you guys to understand this. In this class, we do not cover what happens with it on the back end. That comes in subsequent classes. Because most of that processing happens on the server, and that means you need to learn how to do server-side processing before you get to that point. So you need to work then with server-side languages. All right. So part of like what happens with forms is this. It says the HTML form, forms the web page user interface. So there's a typo in this slide, so I'm fixing it. Yes. So when we use the form tags, we are creating that user interface. And you know what? You can go with the basics, or a little bit of styling can really make it pop. And then there's certain ways that I think people are expecting to see forms, and we're all kind of used to it, so people don't freak out to them that much. The server-side processing part, what would that do? Well, it depends on what your form is doing. So if you were signing up for a newsletter or something, the server-side processing might just add you to a list. So next time they send out an email newsletter, you're on that list, and when they hit send, it pulls up your thing and it sends out an email to you. It might also process a sale, right? So like if you're buying something, or when you get to your more advanced levels of programming in this program, even before you graduate, you guys will learn that a really important part of using forms is to interact with databases on the server. So whether you're looking information up or you're writing information to the database. The long story short is whatever's happening on the server really kind of depends on what the application is doing. And usually some sort of program needs to run on the server to process the information. It just does not happen magically and automatically. It requires something running on the server. All right, now we're going to get to the point where we're going to start playing with the form tags. So if you have not done so already, I want you to open up your file folders and start, first of all, versioning your work, right? And then from there, opening up your editor. So I'm going to keep working with my favorite editor here. So I'm going to fire up Dreamweaver. I got that launching, hopefully. There it goes. And then on my file folder, I'm going to get ready to do my work. I'm going to go to my Web 1 folder. I have a 2019 fall. We're going into Unit 7, is it? Is that correct? I hope so, because I don't have a Unit 7 in here. So I'm going to copy my Unit 6 and paste it back in. That's the way that I'm working. Now, I don't think I have Java Jams and Fish Creeks in here. This is just my project that's going. So this is the copy. I do want to rename that copy so it does say Unit 7 instead. And remember, the reason I do this is that way I can leave my Unit 6 stuff intact. And then if I screw up really bad in Unit 7, I can go back to Unit 6 and start over. Right? I'm not like destroying what I've already done. And it's just a fail-safe. And I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but I had some like little catastrophes in my ASP.NET 2 class, and my computer kept blue screening. And of course, when did it blue screen? Like the one time I didn't version my homework or version my folders. So that's when the stuff happens, is usually when you forget. So always get in that good habit. Version your work, create copies, whatever. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open up all my stuff inside of Dreamweaver here. And I think I have some site definitions. It looks like it's pulling up some old stuff here. Looks like I have to recreate my site definition. I'm going to pause for a second to do that. All right, now that I have a site definition and my folders are opened up inside of Dreamweaver, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to, I think, open up my index page, which also pulls up my CSS. And then I'm also thinking here, why don't I should take a look at where my work sits right now. So I'm going to open it up in a browser and just kind of refresh myself what my pages look like. So I got my home page, my about page. You remember we did our table last week down here. I got the contact page, that's pretty blank. I got my code examples and my gallery, which doesn't do anything. But in terms of a form, I think a real logical place for me, at least, to put a form is going to be on my contact page. So this is the page where I'm going to do my coding, and that's the reason I'm kind of poking around here, is just to confirm that the contact page is going to be a good place to work. So what I've done is I have the contact page up on my screen, and you guys can see that I've created, not much in here. In fact, the only real content area is kind of like this paragraph that I've got highlighted right now. But we're going to start by actually creating a form inside here, and I'm going to put it right here. All right. In fact, instead of saying this is the contact page, I'm going to actually change this tag. Let's change it to an H2. And then right below it, I'm going to create my form like so. Now I noticed that form did not automatically close itself. Actually, that's a little surprising. Usually Dreamweaver is very good about that. But I'm creating the opening and the closing form tags right off the bat. We good? All right. The other thing that I always advise students to do, and I don't know if the book does this immediately or not, is always give your forms an ID. Always give your forms an ID. So I'm just going to put an ID in here and say contact form. Makes sense, because that's what it is? Pretty clear? All right, so let's leave that as is for now. That's going to be enough to start with. And let's look at what the book is suggesting. And I want you to notice this. Form, it says configures a scrolling text box and a container tag. So what it does basically is it just sets up the parameters or kind of the boundaries of what's considered inside this form. So now what I mean by that is this. Let's take a look at that Facebook page one more time if I can get to the browser screen here. Facebook actually has more than one form on this page. This section, the create new account, that's one form. This quick little sign-in box at the top, that's a separate form. So even though they're on the same page. So yes, you can have more than one form per page. If I hit the button for one triggers a login, the other one triggers a sign up. They're two different activities. All right, so there is that possibility. You can have more than one form per page. The first thing that we typically learn how to throw in is an input text box. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And an input can have many different types. So a lot of the stuff that we use to enter information in will be called an input. It'll just have various forms. All right? Now, if I was to set up a contact form, what would be a really logical field to include on my contact form? How about the person's name, right? We could do first name, last name. We could do full name. You guys have a preference? All right. How about this? Let's go ahead, and as good practice once again, I think you should always give every item inside of a form an ID to make it unique. So I'm just going to say first name. Notice how I did it, just all lowercase. The other thing that is good practice is to do this, to also give it a name. And you know what? That name should also match the ID. And these have special meanings when it comes to coding. Right now, we're not going to really do any coding aside from CSS that's going to use these attributes. But when you start to write server-side processing or JavaScript, the ID and the name fields become critical for making JavaScript work correctly on your forms. You guys catching that? So it's considered good practice to always include those on every input field. All right. I would argue too that you should probably name the whole form the same way. So let's just do the same thing up here. Coming back to the input box, there's actually many types of input boxes. And so you see as I start to type here, it starts to give me a list. So let's just quickly kind of scroll through. We got button, checkbox, color, date, date time, email, file, hidden, password, radio, search, etc., 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 etc. The one that we're going to start with is text. All right? I'm not going to add anything else to these fields. I will close it. I want you to notice here that an input box in HTML5 is a self-closing tag. I do not need to do this. Right, and I wouldn't do it in all caps, but I do not need to close it like this. When we were working with XHTML, we would have to do that. We would have to put the closing slash in, and in some cases you might run into applications or forms that still require it. And here's a little caveat for you guys. When you guys get to some server-side processing, there's certain languages like Java is one in particular, that if I don't have the closing slash in there, it won't read my form. So in some cases, you'll find that you'll have to go back and add those in. But for right now, I'm just telling you we don't need to do it. Heck, if we're going to do that, why don't we go ahead and create a last name one right away too? What do you think? I mean, we wouldn't do first name and not do last name, at least that's my thinking. And that one will also be of type text. We good so far? All right. Save your work, and let's go ahead and take a look at this in the browser. So I'm going to just bop back over to my browser, go to my contact page and do a refresh, and it worked. You guys are probably like, it did? That's kind of what you should say. But yeah, but if you look really closely here, you notice there's two boxes where I can type stuff. All right, well, first of all, oh my God, that's like not enough room for me to work with. You guys in agreement? Yeah, it's really kind of condensed. And next thing is, well, I got two boxes, but it doesn't tell me at all what I should put inside them. Okay, so let's kind of address both of those issues right now. First of all, let's make a little bit of space. And I'm going to do this. I'm actually going to encapsulate my form inside of a div. And I'm going to say form box. It's the best I can come up with right now. And I'm going to close that div after the closing form tag. And then I'm going to do my little technique of always saying close form box. And then I know which closing div that goes with. Now I'm going to jump over to my CSS folks. And I'm going to create a little bit of space for my form and my form box. It's going to drop right down to the bottom of the document. You want to know how to get to the bottom of a document quickly? Press Control End. Just so you know. You guys notice how many lines of CSS I have already? Yeah. It's not unusual when you get a really big fancy website to have thousands of lines of CSS. Yeah. Just so you know. All right, so I'm going to work on that ID called form box, and notice how it pops up on my list there. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create padding for it, just to give it space. So I'm going to give it an ample amount of padding. I'm going to go 50 pixels. So inside the box that holds the form, I'm going to have 50 pixels on top, right, bottom, and left. So it's going to give me some space around the form. Let's save that. Let's make sure that the contact form is also saved. And let's go back to the browser again. Let's refresh. And so now I have a little more space, right? It's not so congested. Are we agreed? Yes. Okay, good. It still doesn't tell me what should go in those boxes. So let's go back and address that issue. How about we do this? I think looking at this, maybe these two should be on separate lines. That's pretty easy to do. I can actually just put in a line break, right? Heck, why not? Let's put in a line break. Puts it on the next line. The other thing that would look nice is if maybe I had a little bit of text before it that told me what it is I'm looking at. So one thing you could do is you could just type first name, and then I want you guys to notice also as I'm doing this, this text is just hanging there. Technically it's not within a tag, and that's not really considered good, but that's where we're going to start, and then we're going to kind of adjust as we go. First name, last name. And I'm actually putting a space after each one of these too. All right, let's save that. Let's go back and take a look. Hey, a little better, right? I'll tell you what would look even better to my eyes. It's 2 line breaks in between. I know these are like picky little things. That's a little more comfortable for me. Looks a little better? Yes. Can I type into it? Sure thing. This is exciting and fun. Right? Can I do anything with it? Hell no. All I'm doing is, but I created the boxes, right? And now I know what should go in them. So not too bad. All right, so we're getting there, one step at a time. All right, let's go back to the book here. And what the author is going to do now is he's going to step through and he's going to talk about all the different form things. So I'm going to do the same thing, and then I'm going to start following his example. So the first thing he does is he talks about the form itself, and then that we have input fields. And input fields include a bunch of different options, and notice all the different options. Text boxes, radio buttons, check boxes, buttons, and the standalone tag. Then we have a tag called text area. That's where you get a larger box where you can type in like a long comment or something. You also have what you call select and option boxes. That's what creates the drop-down boxes where you can select from a list that's pre-configured. All right, so those are all the things we're going to explore here, and then a bunch of the newer ones that come too. All right, so one thing that you might consider doing is, and this is something that I think would fit with most websites, right, is if you want a contact form, you want a way to contact a person, or in this case they have the example of somebody signing up for a newsletter, and they have an email field. And then, if you look at what the author is doing here, he's following very much my format, although he put the type first, right, and then indicated the name and the ID. And it doesn't really matter what order you put them in, but you can totally do that. One thing that he did add that's a step up from what we did is he's actually got the button in there. And you see the code for that? It's very simple. It's just input, type, submit. And then another one called input, type, reset. Let's try that. Let's go ahead and try that. So down here at the bottom, I'm going to put in a couple more line breaks right after last name. And then I'm going to create a new input. I'm going to say type equals submit. All right. Should I give it a name and ID? My suggestion is that you do. So you can say submit button. And I always like to be verbose and specific about what it is. So I would say, and once again, this doesn't really matter much to us right now, folks. But it will when you start writing JavaScript. They also had another button that was similar. So I'm just copy pasting here. And that was of type reset. That's kind of weird. And so I'm going to change all this to reset. All right. Let's save it and see what we've created. Hey, I got some buttons up there. They look hideous. You can barely see them, right? So, looks like they click though. Looks like it's trying to do something, right? There's also a reset button. That looks like it's kind of doing something. Well, let's type something in. If I type something in and hit reset, what happens? It clears it. That's what reset does. Whether or not you include a reset button on a form is very subjective. I'm going to tell you that. In the old days, it was considered proper etiquette to always include it. In modern times, what I've seen in modern development is people avoid it and don't put it in. So some of it is just an aesthetic choice. So that's up to you. If I type something in and then hit submit, well, it looks like it did something, but you know what it really did? Is absolutely nothing, folks, right? And really it ended up clearing the form. However, if we add to our form a link to wherever the server-side script is that's going to process this, it would send it off to the server and it would process it. Interesting. All right. I'm with it, but that we do have a submit button, even though it's not very pretty right now. It would be a little bit easier to see if we didn't have a background that had almost the same color as the button, but those buttons are there as separate buttons. Now remember, I have overrides on borders, margin, and padding, so the buttons look a little bit smaller than they normally would, but we can tweak all of that stuff later. All right, so that's a input of submit and reset. Let's go back up to the top of the whole form element and start actually looking at some of the attributes that you add to the form by default. So we'll talk about these one at a time, starting from the bottom up. So I've already told you that whenever you're working with form elements, it's always a good idea to put in a name and an ID for the form. The convention that most coders use is they use the same name as they do for ID. One is relevant for CSS when styling forms, and then one is relevant for JavaScript when processing forms. And can you process a form off the ID field? You can, but sometimes you get these weird little conflicts because you're styling and processing at the same time. So that's why they use both. The other thing that we often throw in is an action and a method. I'm going to add these in one at a time and then talk about what they do. First of all, methods will have two different approaches. So let's go back to the top of the form tag here, and now we're going to add some stuff in. The first thing I'm going to add is method. Now, you notice that I have some different options here, but by default, if you don't specify it, so if I don't write this in, this is what it is automatically. As a programmer, my advice is always you throw in the specific one you want. There's get and there's post, and let me explain the difference between what those mean. When I go to Google something, right? And I want to look up, I don't know, ASDF, right? I don't know if you guys know, but that's a thing, right? So I'm Googling ASDF, and yes, there's this whole series of silly, like YouTube videos. You guys ever seen these? Yeah, the young people will nod and smile. I think they're hilarious. My kids turned me on to them, and I don't know, I think they're funny. Anyhow, but if you come up to the top here and look at my URL, notice after google.com, it's triggering search, and then here, in plain text, is the search term I typed in. Now, when I filled out the Google form, whatever search criteria it's throwing at its database is plain for us to see in plain text right in the URL. We can read what Google is sending to its own server to do the search. Now, what's fascinating about that is it's in plain text and it's visible to us as the users. That indicates to me that the form, Google search form, its method is get, because if you use get, the moment that you send something, whatever you put in the form gets encoded into the address bar in plain text for the world to see. So if I go back, actually I didn't even need to leave the browser, to Mr. Robot here, and here, let's load the page from scratch. and I type something in, and I hit submit, I want you to watch the address bar when I hit submit. Now it didn't go anywhere, right? But do you notice what the address bar now says? After contact.html, the page I'm working on, it put in a question mark, and then it added first name equals what I typed in. It put in an ampersand, which means on to the next field. Put in last name, the field name that I filled in, with the text I typed, and it put in that I hit the submit button called submit button, and what was the action? Submit. So because I put in the method of get, whatever the form contained, the moment I hit that submit button, it's all in the URL. Isn't that fascinating? Everything that I typed in, and that's exactly how it's passed to the server. I'll show you the other option, which is post. And this is the other option at your entry levels of coding. I do want to mention that as well. You do get or post. If I use post, so if I go back to the contact page now, let me make sure that it's loading that version. And so I'm going to my form tag. All right, it says post. All right, so it says post. And I type in the same stuff. And now I hit my submit button. Watch the URL. Nothing, right? That's the difference between the two. Now, post, what it does is when you type stuff in the form, it obscures it in transit. It does not appear back in the URL in plain text. It is being sent via plain text to the server, which then can process the information. Now, of course, if you were doing a credit card number or a password, you want to use post, right? You don't want somebody just walking up to your browser, looking at the address bar and getting your credit card number or your password. And then the other facet would be you also want to go to a website where there's a lock active in the corner so we know that it's actually secure. And of course, the stuff we're doing right now isn't, but you know, if you were doing a real application, you would try to make it so. But that's the difference between get and post. For the stuff that we are doing right now, you'll stick with get for the most part. Some server-side scripts that would process your form would require that you do a post in order to even work. All right, so that's kind of a whole separate issue, a higher level thing. So once again, method get puts your stuff in plain text in the URL. If you don't type this in, if you don't add a method attribute, get is automatic. That's the default. The other attribute that we add to our form tag is called action. And the action is where we declare what we're doing after we hit the submit button. So for example, if you were doing like PHP programming, right, where we can process server side, you might have something called process form.php. And that would be the file that processes your form. It reads it, puts it in the database, does something on the screen, who knows. Whatever it does it. Right? So in this point in time, we haven't learned how to do any of that stuff yet, so we got to do something a little bit more primitive. What we're going to do instead is, how about this? If a user comes to your contact form and like signs up for your newsletter and they hit submit and they give you all their info, how about you send them to a thank you page? How does that sound? That seems pretty reasonable to me. So if we're going to do that though, we'd better create a thank you page to send them to first. But I can preemptively type in thank you.html here and then create the page. So let's save this. I'm going to drop out to my file system and go to where my files are and make a copy. You know, I suppose I can do that right within Dreamweaver. I don't really need to go out to do that. But I'm going to copy my contact form, and then I'm going to paste it back in. and then I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to call it same way, all lowercase, no spaces, thankyou.html. And so I'm going to open up that file, right? Let's change the title up here and add thank you, right? May as well. And then in the main contact area, and I suppose that can, I'll get rid of the form because we're going to be on a different page now, right? I'm just going to type in, thank you for sending us your info. Some sort of courtesy. All right? Let's take a look at that page really quick and just make sure it looks okay-ish. All right. It could use some CSS help, obviously, right? Like big time. Should we do that? Let's put it inside of a div. Let's close that div. Let's give that div, I don't know, ID or class. Let's give it a class this time. I'm going to call it some room, and you'll see why I'm calling it that. So I'm saving the thank you page now, going back to my CSS, way at the bottom. That was a class name, correct? Some room. Put my curlies in there. I'm just going to do padding again, and an ample amount. Save it. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put that class tag on the H2s. On the contact page, I'm also going to do that on the thank you page. Well, I'm going to put, okay, so I got that H2 is just in the box. All right. Same basic effect. Let's take a look at what we did. Just a little room. That's all I'm doing. Let's go to the contact page. Once again, a little bit of room. All right. Now comes the fun part. If you'll recall, on the contact page where we have our form, I added an action attribute to the form tag, which means when I hit that submit button, when I'm done, it's going to send the information and send us, the users, to the thank you page. All right, let's try it out and see if that actually works. So let's actually put in like a name here. Oops. All right, well, I hit enter by mistake. I wanted to actually type the whole name in. John Smith, you know, something really generic. Then I'm going to hit submit. And I want you to notice it did take us to the thank you page, but it also passed to the thank you page the information. When you learn some JavaScript, you can read that information and put it back on the screen. So I could say, thank you for sending us your information, John Smith. Welcome to our newsletter club, or whatever, you know. We haven't learned that stuff yet, but you will. It's coming, okay? One step at a time. Let's get this to work first. But now we have this perception, at least, that when we come in here and we type in whatever we type in and we hit submit, that it's actually working. But the reality is it's not doing anything. For right now, for us, this is enough. But there is that perception that it's working. Do we agree? Okay, good. Let's move on and start adding to this now. Back to the PowerPoint. So we went through that slide there, and then we've already kind of worked with the input text box already, but here's the reality. We did it on a very primitive level, and there's a couple of other things that we can tinker with to change this. So we've tried type, name, and ID already, but notice they have a couple other things that we can throw in as well. So what they're throwing in here is size, max length, and value. All right, so let me give you an example of each one of those. So for size, I might set this to, I don't know, 50, and you know, without knowing what these things do, the only way you're really going to find out is to try it. So what did that do? It made the box a whole lot bigger. The thought is there's enough room for 50 characters to be typed in. Do I really need my first name field that long? I would say no. Okay. So on the first name, I don't think it's very relevant, frankly. Okay. But I'll tell you where it might work. What if I add another text box in between first and last name and call it middle initial, right? And I'm just going to call this middle initial, and I like to be verbose with these, meaning I'd rather have it be longer, totally describing what it does. And here, I would set a size. What size should I set it for? Yeah, some people say 1, right? That's kind of the intuition. I'm going to caution you, some people have more than one middle initial, and sometimes when people put in middle initials, they also put in the dot. So at the minimum, you should have 2 characters. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go for 2. But I've also discovered lately that there's people that are like, well, my name is like Joseph Alexander, you know, Brandon, Jack, whatever, you know, like they have like 10 middle names and they have like a whole bunch of initials in the middle. So, all right, but let's go with 2. All right, let's save this. Take a look once again at what we created. All right, middle initial. You with me? All right. Next thing that you can add is a thing called max length. Now, I think that's kind of intuitive. So what if I set my max length to 5 for first name? Refreshing, and then I start typing. Oh, I can't type anymore. It cuts me off. All right. That's probably not good for first name, once again. That might be excellent for middle initial, though. So I'm going to say max length 2. You can put in your initial and the period, and that's it, buddy. That's all you get. Let's test it. Refreshing. So I'm going to put in F, a dot, and that's all I can put in. All right, so we're seeing that it's working. So that's max length. Now, we've done a little bit of a layout here, and you notice I've decided to put the first name and then the box. Go down a couple lines, do middle initial, and then the box. All right, so that's one technique for doing layout. What some people have been doing is this instead, and I'll just demonstrate the technique. And I'm going to tell you what, I think this technique looks better than the one I have. So watch the transition here. Instead of having the label for the box to the left, I just moved them to be on top. And you know what? I didn't like this at first, but in some ways I like this better now. Right? And that's just this is a preference thing, folks. All right? Now, a different technique that a lot of modern coders are using is this. Is they're actually putting in values in advance. So let me give you an example. Instead of like putting it in the last name or first name, and we talked about maybe if they're signing up for like a newsletter or something, maybe we would actually add a field for email. Trying to double click here. There we go. All right, so I'm going to put in an email field, and then I'm going to just throw in an extra field. Oops. So I'm going to copy all of that. And actually, I don't need the line breaks, do I? Not above, I need them below. And how about your favorite food? Okay, I'm just putting it out there. All right. And we'll call this fave food. Save it. If I want to predetermine an entry for a field, I can use value. So, you know what? I'm going to guess that most people's favorite food is pizza. And I think that's a pretty, right? If it's not one of your favorites, it's certainly in the top 5 for most people. So let's just save that and see what that looks like. So I added a field, and look at what this one does. It pre-enters the information. So you might like that, and you might not, and sometimes that'll be useful. So for example, like if you had a contact form that you created for your children's school, just think about this, right? Chances are that those people live in your town and state, so you could probably pre-fill the town and state for them, because chances are they're in that community, right? And in some cases, you can't make that assumption, but that's kind of what the value field does. It allows you to pre-create entries. All right. Let's talk about this. This is a different one. Notice this one does have a closing tag. This is the thing called text area. And we're going to use it very much like what you see on screen here. So I'm going to list right below here comments. Let's put a colon in because I think that looks better. And then I'm going to go ahead and create a text area. I'm noticing it's not creating the closing one automatically, but I'm going to go ahead and do that. And you know what? I am going to type some text in between those and say, type your comments here. Saved it. Let's refresh. All right, and it created that little comments box. But you know what? That's really small. I got a lot to say, and it's not going to fit in that little box, right? Do you guys know that whenever you see this little symbol here in the corner, that you can click and drag and make it bigger? Did you guys know that? That's true inside of Blackboard too, by the way. Whenever you see that on a form, and that appears automatically. All right. Let's clean that up a little bit. Let's move the buttons down too. Oops. So I guess below it, let's add a couple of line breaks, because those buttons certainly shouldn't be right on it. And then if you notice on the slide, well, they say that we should have a name and an ID. Okay, well, I guess we didn't do that. And then we can also put in columns and rows. So let's play with all of those. First of all, let's come up and name it. And let's name it comments, spelled correctly, right? then we may as well do the ID the same way. And then what were the other two attributes? Columns. Now columns is kind of like the size thing for name that we were trying before. So how many columns of characters do we want to go across? I'm gonna say like 40 seems about right to me. And then how many rows of characters do we want? How about we go 10? And I'm just shooting a number out there. Worst thing that's going to happen is we change it, right? So if we don't like the size and the shape that it is. So let's go back now and take a look. Oh, wait a second. That didn't do what I anticipated. It certainly got wider, right? But where's my 10 rows? You notice how it automatically puts a scroll bar in too. All right. Did I put my tag in incorrectly? Yes. I typed row, not rows. So as soon as I typed the S, I was a little surprised when I saw it, honestly. I was like, boy, I've really gotten bad at coding. All right, but there it is. 40 columns and 10 rows. That looks a little bit more reasonable. In fact, I might even say that the columns could be a little bigger, but whatever. But it will allow you to type in here and whatever. If I hit submit, it takes me to thank you page. Are all those like nonsense characters typed into the comment field? Well, if I look at this URL, yeah, it's all in there. It's all in there. All right, so that's a text area. All right, why don't we take a break? We're a good hour or so into class right now, and I think we need it. Let's take 5. We'll come back and keep working on this. All right, let's continue on. I'm going to pull the PowerPoint back up on the screen here as we come back from break. So we just did the text area thing, and hopefully you guys got that to work okay. Next thing that they want us to look at is the submit button, which we've kind of already done. We kind of sneaked ahead a little bit. But notice that some important information here. Okay, so it submits the information, but when it's clicked, what it actually does is it triggers the action that's listed in the form tag at the top. All we've chosen to do is to send the information basically to another dummy page that makes it look like something happened, although nothing did. However, if you really write a real web application and you are working with a real server-side language, you will have an actual script or a program that you're pushing it to process the form. And whatever program that is, it'll receive the information, probably store it in some variables or something, and then either write it to a database or use it to do other work on the website. But it will actually do something with the information. All right. The attributes that you typically use for a submit button is you do say type submit, but you can also give it a name, an ID, and a value. So we kind of haven't done that yet. So let's go back and do that. Well, we did give it an ID and a name. All right, so we did do that. But we didn't do value. Now this is kind of interesting. With value, I can actually choose what the button says. Isn't that cool? So it doesn't have to say submit. So what would be a better name for it? Let's say if they're signing up for our mailing list.
Sign up?
Sure, why not? Sign up for mailing list. Let's go ahead and save that. Let's look at it on the actual form. And so now our button says, sign up for mailing list. Okay. And you can see that it still works. The other thing I'm going to do is that reset button, I don't like that it's sitting like right there. I'm going to put a couple of line breaks in there just to kind of push it down out of the way. The other thing that I can also do is actually style that submit button. You know, like how like Google's, excuse me, Facebook's is like big and green. It's like really obvious that you should click on it. Should we do the same thing to ours? Hey, why not? Yes, you can actually style it. So I'm going to choose the ID submit button, and I'm going to put some styles on it. So let's save our form here for first thing. Let's go all the way to the bottom. Start throwing the stuff in. What was that, a class or an ID? ID. What was it called? Submit button. I'm trying to see if you guys are paying attention, but I guess not. I'm going to put a little padding on that button to make it a little bit bigger, and I'm just going to go 10 pixels on it. That's going to go all the way around it. I'm going to choose a background color. What would be a good color for it? How about like a kind of like a green, like Google's using, or Facebook, excuse me. Why do I keep saying whatever? And you know what? If I'm going to use a green background, you know what? And maybe that green's a little too primary colored. Maybe a darker green would be better. Maybe this green would be better. And then I'm going to make the color or the text on the button white. And I'm also going to make the font size a little bit bigger. I'm going to go with 125% of normal. Whatever it normally was, it's going to be 25% bigger. Let's take a look at what that looks like now. Not too bad, right? I'm going to say that that padding is not quite enough. I'm going to make it twice what it is. And you know, the other thing that would be kind of cool is maybe I could put a border on it. So let's make it 1 pixel. Boy, it really wants me to pick a color. You know what? I think black is fine. And let's make it a solid line. And then I'm going to do a border radius of, I don't know, 7 pixels to give it some rounded corners on it. I'm just going to do a refresh here. What do you think? You know, it could be better, but you know, not too bad. Not too bad, right? It's pretty obvious you should click on it though, right? And that's kind of the point, honestly. The point is to make it really obvious to your users, where do I click? Oh, here it is. All right. Now that's like really the first thing in here that we've CSS'd, but you can CSS all the stuff on the form, and I'm going to in due time. First I want to kind of get all the stuff on the screen. But the button, since we were talking about buttons, I figured, hey, well, why not? Let's make it look cool. All right. We also did the reset button, right? We already saw what that does, so now this is what they've built so far. They've built a contact us form. They put in first name, last name, email. We're kind of following in their tracks. But what if somebody wanted to create an application that accepts a password? Now, we could ask the user when they, to create a new account, that we could ask them for a password right away, right? Why don't we do that? Let's go ahead and go back to the contact form. Maybe right below email. And with email, this will be your username. Probably want to tell them, right? And in fact, just to make sure it stands out a little bit, I might actually put it in italics. It's kind of the way I think, at least. And then let's go ahead and add the password field, let's put it right here and say password. And we should probably change the ID to password, right? Maybe the name to password. Did you notice that there's also a type, you guys, for password? And by applying that, what's cool about that is this. Watch when that field appears. When I actually type into this one, it obscures your letters automatically. No special coding required. That's brand new to HTML5, by the way. In the old days, like 10 years ago, not even that long ago actually, we would have to write JavaScript that would take every keystroke and convert it to different character in order to do this. And in HTML5, they're like, well, why don't we just build that in and make it type password and it just does it automatically? Yep, brilliant plan. I love it. But if you're asking somebody for a password, you should probably ask them to do what?
Maybe case sensitive?
Confirm password.
That works too.
Right? We probably want them to confirm their password and then put in a second field that allows them to re-enter it. And then I might call it like password 2. And then you might say in parentheses here again, and I'm just thinking, right? Minimum 6 characters, 1 upper, 1 number, whatever your parameters are, you should probably tell them in advance. That's my thinking. I hate it when you have to type it in and you type it in wrong and then they tell you. That's just kind of my thinking. Minimum 6 characters, and maybe you might say max, 15. And then you could put on the password field max length 15. And that way you prevent them from putting in too much. But did you also know that you can put in, you can't do min length? You can't do min length. So you would have to enforce the minimum length with JavaScript. Now, we won't have a script in there that double checks to make sure that those are the same, but that's another thing that you would do with JavaScript. With JavaScript, you would say, make sure that password equals password 2, otherwise stop right there. Okay. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting, and we'll come back to this in a second, is with some form fields. All right, so I got to fix that. But now I got 2 spots where I can type passwords too.
And there'll be no more than 15, it'll just be 15 and then.
Yeah, I can't type beyond that point. Yeah. All right. So with this, that needs a line break right here to fix it. And maybe we only use 1 there. Let's take a look again. Not too, could be better, could be worse. Gets the point across for now. All right, let's move on. Let's move on to the structure called a checkbox. So checkbox is like one of these things, and you've seen these before. In fact, the code that they use here is probably fine. So let's take a look at an input box. So we're asking for favorite food. Maybe we should ask what browser they use. So let's do that right here. And of course, I'm going to put in this, I'm going to keep my pattern of a couple of line breaks between elements, just so you know. And I'm going to put in just a really simple little paragraph here that says, choose the browser's and so here we'll put in an input box, and this is where it gets, I think, a little interesting. So for example, let's give it an ID and the name, and I'm not really quite sure what to name them yet, so let's just leave those blank for right now. But we want to indicate that this is a checkbox. We do need to say type equals checkbox. And then we will have a value, oops, that goes with it. All right. So let's think of all the different browsers there are. Chrome is one.
Firefox,
And then I'm going to copy this, and now you're going to see my strategy. Why I didn't put a name and an ID in. Because now when I start pasting these in, I don't have to change as much text. Firefox. Oops. How about Edge? Name another. Opera, very good.
Microsoft Edge.
Well, I already got that one in there.
Okay, do you have Firefox?
Internet Explorer.
There you go.
And really, folks, at this point, you should not be using that browser at all. Even Microsoft tells you that. What other major browser are we missing? Safari.
No.
Yeah, if Joe was here, he'd remind us of that. And then there might be others, right? All right, I'm going to do a really quick little record catch up here because I realized I didn't hit record when I came back. But basically what we've added since we've come back from break is we've added the password field, right? And with the password field, we set the type to password. And the unique feature of that is when you type into the text box, it obscures your characters. And since we did a one password field, we also did a confirm your password field. We also set it to a max length because we only want them to be so long. Then we went and we learned about putting checkboxes together. So you see here, I created a quick little paragraph and then a series of inputs that are of type checkbox. And that created on the screen for us this little list. And the point that we were just making here in class is that when you use checkboxes like this that are associated to each other, they allow for what we call multiple selection. So like for me, I would check all those, although I'm not really much of an Opera user or Internet Explorer user anymore. Every once in a while, I do use them, but this would allow me, a checkbox allows me to choose more than one item. And you know what? I would argue that you might even want to remind your user of that and do something like select all that apply. To tell them, basically, you can select more than one, right? Why not tell them that right off the bat? All right. So for all of these where we left the ID and the name blank, you guys, you want to go in and you want to fill in each one of those. And what I would suggest is that you use whatever is here, that you match it up. So I'm just going to kind of methodically go through the process of copy pasting. And you know what? I think I might even be doing this wrong. All right, so you want to make sure that you have names and IDs on all of those. Now, here's what's going on in my head. I'm like thinking to myself, should the names and the IDs all be different or should they all be the same? You know, frankly, I'm just not remembering. So I'm going to go to W3 Schools. So here's me demonstrating that you should go to W3 Schools if you're unsure about something. And I'm just going to type in, right here on Google, I'm going to type checkbox so that it takes me right to their checkbox page. And actually, I'm seeing that the name, okay, well, it should be different, I guess. All right. See, what I was trying to figure out is I know with radio boxes, you set your name and ID to all be identical, and that's the way it prevents multiple selections, but I guess with a checkbox, that's not the case. That's interesting. All right. So that validates something I was thinking in my head, but just like a little example that I can't remember everything about this, so where do I go when I have a question? There's a perfect example. All right? Never be embarrassed to admit that you don't know something. Find the answer and then move forward. All right. Let's move on to the next thing, which is this thing called radio buttons, which are very, very similar to checkboxes, but what's the difference?
The buttons, they're basically, they're clickable instead of check.
Yeah. Well, they're like check boxes, except they're round, they're not square. And the other feature about them is that they do only allow for one input at a time. So what I'm going to do here is I'm trying to save myself some coding is really what's going on here. That's why I'm just copy pasting stuff. So I'm going to copy and paste in a radio button structure that I already have created. So here he says choose the browsers you use, or maybe we should say you have tried. So you may have tried all of them, right? But then I'm asking you to select your favorite browser, which is a little different. Now notice the difference here. I put in type radio, which gives me the different type of button, and then notice that the name and the ID on these are all the same. Okay? And I actually see that I'm missing a couple, so let's put in the others. What were the other ones? Internet. Explorer. What's the other one I'm missing? Safari. And let's save that. Yeah. So here it's telling me the IDs must be unique. So the names can all be the same. So that's where my error is. So best 1, best 2, best 3, best 4, best 5, But F6, and then if it breaks my radio button, then I'll yell at Dreamweaver. But you see how Dreamweaver highlights my errors right away?
Mhm.
Yeah. All right, let's save that and then load it up in the browser and refresh. And so this creates a list that looks like this. And notice, when I go to click on these, I can only select one. If I don't use the same name, though, so if I like change the name, let's say on the first one, save it, back to the browser and refresh, now I can select Edge and one of the others just because that one's got a different name. Isn't that interesting? So you have to make sure when you do those radio buttons, folks, that all the names for any of the ones where you want the selection to be unique, they all have to have the same name. They should have separate IDs though. This is a little bit of a difference from what we saw before. Okay, so those are radio buttons. Every once in a while, this one I'm not going to demonstrate, some form designers will have what they call hidden fields. Now, this is kind of weird. So why on earth would somebody send hidden information on a form that the user can't see? Let me give you an example. When I was coding e-commerce applications, shopping carts in particular, the user would go in there, they'd find their product, they like the product, they look at it, and they click add to cart, right? And then eventually they go check out. When I would process shipping rates, though, I would always need to know what is the weight of the product and the dimensional size of the product. So in other words, if I was putting it in a box for like UPS or something, that's how they figure out like how to get the shipping charge is by weight and size, right? And then zip code ultimately. So one thing I would always put in hidden form fields whenever they would select an add to cart thing is it would also pass the weight and the size off to the checkout application so that it would know how to calculate shipping weight, right? But the user didn't need to see that, but the application needed it in order to process the information. So that's why we do those. It's information that's useful for whatever is processing the form, but not necessarily necessary for the user to see. This really kind of weird little thing like that. All right. Let's move on to the select list. All right, and talk about how that works. Right? This is what we call, depending on where you're working, what format, what environment you're working in, some people will call these drop-down boxes, some people call them select boxes, some people call them option boxes, whatever, but they're all basically the same thing. It allows a user to select one or more, and this is kind of a key thing, items from a list of predetermined choices. So instead of giving people checkboxes to pick their favorite browser, you can just come in here, hit the drop down, and pick it, right? What a lot of people do in modern application development with these types of drop-down lists is sometimes you go in there and you make a selection and it automatically triggers JavaScript, maybe takes you to a different page or loads something different on the screen. That happens a lot too. The select list really kind of forms largely in combination with an options list. So the select list creates the drop down, the option list creates the list of options that go inside. Right, so you use those two things together, select and option. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy in some code, of course, that I've already created. And I'm doing this mostly to kind of just speed up our process here. So we don't waste too much time typing. Since none of you are typing along and hurting my feelings. All right. All right, so this is one I did from a previous year. And so here's an example. The structure starts with the select tag, so that encapsulates the whole thing, right? The select tag is given a name and an ID, so I'm calling it car. And then the option list, and notice options do open and close. You put in there which car you like. Okay, so I put in Volvo, Saab, Mercedes, BMW, Audi, car, AKA junker, whatever, and you can put whatever stuff you want in here. And then based on whichever option the user chooses, then the value and the value attribute will be passed through with the form. All right, let's see what that looks like on the page. Refresh. So, choose the car you like. There's our box. Cool, right? Yeah, it is pretty cool. Yeah, well, I put it in plain text. But you can see that that's kind of cool. And you see how easy it is to put onto a page? It's a piece of cake. The real magic happens in the aftermath, like when you get the server processing going. But making it look cool on the page is not a big deal at all. That's select, and then the options that go inside. So every time you add an option, right? So if you can think of like if you've ever been on a website and you say, choose your state, and you have a list of 50 states, they have to have an option listing for each one. And guess what most programmers do? They just go out to other websites that already have it and copy it. Because that's a lot of typing to type in 50 states, right? Yeah, absolutely. All right. Here's another technique. I'm not going to demonstrate this one, but I'm just going to show you that you can do it. If you prefer not to use a button in the native form, and you guys saw already from what I was doing on the form that you can style your buttons with CSS, and you can make them look a lot nicer than than this, right? And a lot more obvious to click on as well. But you can, if you choose, instead of using the default button, you can actually use an image in place of the button and still have the button submit the form. All right, so the technique for doing that is you just simply say type image, and then of course you're going to add a source attribute to indicate where the image is coming from, usually your images folder or whatever, right? Another thing that you should know is that there is a special form element that they added with HTML5 called button. All right? This is kind of weird, right? Because, okay, well, we do input type submit, it automatically creates a button, and for most forms, that's enough. But really big in application development now is people creating buttons all over the place to do different things, not necessarily process a form. But buttons are still considered form elements, and they do have a tag that goes with it, obviously called button. And you notice it's a container tag, and it says, when clicked, its function depends on the value of the type of attribute. So in other words, if I tell it it's a button type submit, it will act as a submit button. Otherwise, I would give it an ID, and then I would write JavaScript or something to do something with it. And yes, you can put inside the button tag text, images, and even media. You can even have like a video be a button, and that's kind of weird, but maybe not so much so when you think about some of the websites you visit. So what they suggest that you do with these is you can create a button and then put type submit, type reset, or type button. Submit, of course, will act like the submit button. Reset will act like the reset button. Button will just be a button. All right, so it's not unusual, for example. So I'm just going to kind of like throw a button on the page just to show you. So a couple of line breaks. Yes, John?
I'm gonna guess it's like the text, just that plain with word, we'll just say button.
Right. All right. And what type is it? And it's a good idea to at least put in the type, and I always say the type is button, because it's a button. You don't technically need to put that in, but it's considered good practice. And then naming it, I'm going to call it Nada BTN. And then I'm going to create an ID that's the same thing. Yep, and that's a button that does nothing. And I can CSS the heck out of it, make it look pretty. But what you might do with that, in all practical purposes, is you might write applications where you use that button to trigger JavaScript on your page, or trigger some things to happen. Or what some designers are doing now is instead of using input type submit to create a button, they just create a button and then they just change the code, excuse me, here, and they say button type submit, so that button would do the submitting also. But you should only have one submit button per page, folks, relative to a form. So if you opt to do this, change it to type submit, rather than do this, a lot of designers are doing that now. But yes, you can create buttons anywhere. You do all sorts of silly things with them. All right, let's talk about some of these accessibility elements here that they have designed for forms. And I'm going to tell you what, I am a fan of some of these, but not a fan of all of these. I'm just telling you. So for example, the first one they're going to demonstrate is a label. And notice what they're doing with the label tag here. They're taking a label, and we kind of already have put text to describe our fields in there, but you notice with the label tag, you can use it in two different ways. My favorite way to use it is the second way as opposed to the first, and this is just a personal preference, mind you. The first way takes that label tag and encapsulates the whole input with the label tag. So the text here that describes it is directly associated with it because they're inside the same tag. I don't always think that, like when reading the code, that's aesthetically clean. So I usually prefer to go this route, which is to take the label tag, put it separate from the input, but then you put in this little for thing, which tells you which one it's intended for. All right, so here's the advantage of doing that. So I'm going to kind of go back, and I'm going to, on some of these, I'm not going to do it to all of them. I am going to do label. Then I'm going to say for. What's it for? It is for first name. And then I would close my label here. Okay. Functionally, on the page, the result of it, when I refresh, it doesn't change a thing. Okay? But what it's done now, has attached, because of that for attribute, it has attached that label to that input field. And that's really considered good HTML etiquette, because now those two items are associated. See what I mean? The other advantage of using the label tag is that if you put all your labels inside of label tags, then you can style them all at once. And to me, that's probably the most compelling reason to do that, is to put that label tag on everything just so you can style all the labels all at once. Because right now, the way that this descriptive text sits, this is kind of just hanging in midair. How do I style it? See the conundrum? It's text inside a form. I guess I can put the style on form. That's probably not smart, actually. Okay, so that's the one reason why you might want to do that. So what I would recommend is that you do include all your labels for your form elements in that format for each individual field. So I would go through, if I was trying to do this right for homework, and I would add the label tag to each one of these one at a time. Okay? Let's move on to field set and legend. And I'm going to demonstrate, I'm not going to demonstrate these, but I'm going to show them to you on the screen here. So here's an example of what these things do. So the field set element, once again, it's a container tag, and it creates what it says, a grouping of form elements on a page. So if you have a form that's kind of complex, so it has different sections, for example, and you can see like this one, the top box on the right says customer information. And then maybe down below it'll say like order information or whatever, you know, the additional information. You put the field set tags around a grouping of elements, and then it forms that box that goes around, and then kind of logically groups them together. When you're using default HTML, CSS, right, the CSS that's built into the browser, that box will appear like that. And some people like it and some people hate it. I tend to be more on the side of like, I really don't like it. Because, you know, personally, the field set I think is useful, but I don't like the fact that it creates a box and puts a name on like the border. That's just an aesthetic thing, right? Because I could hypothetically also put stuff inside the form in a div, give that a class or an ID, and then style that separately if I want like sections. Okay, so use that as you see fit. The other one is the legend element, and the legend would actually be the piece right inside here, notice right inside the field set, that actually declares that text that goes up here. So yes, that can be omitted if you don't want it. Okay, but that's how you can control that text. Another thing that's kind of interesting is this, the tab index attribute. Now this is something that usually for HTML forms you don't worry about. But let me show you something that's kind of interesting. I'm going to take this page and I'm going to just refresh it in the browser, and here I sit on the screen. All right, I'm going to click into the window up here near the top so I know that the screen is active. I am now going to press my tab key, and I want you to watch the screen really carefully as I do this, and I'll say every time I press the key, pressed. What happened? Mr. Robot highlighted. Did you notice that? Because it's the first clickable item on the page. Pressing tab again. Where is it? Home. That's the second item. Tab. 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 You see it moving? Now, where's it going to go when I press tab next? Well, it's going to go right here. It jumps you right to the box. Now, the tab key, and if you guys don't know this, a lot of applications that have form fields, and browsers are not an exception, a lot of applications that have form fields automatically allow you to tab from field to field, box to box, so that you can operate the application without a mouse, folks. There are people that cannot use mice. Think of Stephen Hawking. How do you think he was surfing the web? He certainly wasn't mousing around, right? But he might have had like a little thing that he could hit a tab key and move around. I don't know, he probably had an assistant do it for him. But if I hit the tab key again, it goes to the next field. Sometimes you get forms, though, that are complex. So in other words, you'll have like a series of things here, you may have some more things here, some more things here. and you can actually control the order of the tabs, and that's what the tab index is. So I can actually set up a sequential numbering system on the form fields, so for those that are tabbing, I can dictate what order they go in. But I will tell you, in all practicality, most of us tend to do top-down forms without multiple columns. It's not really an issue, so leaving that out is okay. But it's really good information to know. When you create visually complex forms where there's like maybe like 100 fields to enter, then the tab index makes a whole lot more sense to go in there and figure out. Usually that's one of the last things you do though. Another thing that you can do, and I'm going to tell you what, this one is not recommended in general because what a lot of people forget about this one is the fact that there's so many predetermined keys on the keyboard that it's hard to find keys that are open to address actions to. So for example, what they're saying here is an access key is a key that you press in combination with the control key to trigger your cursor to go right to that field. So if I wanted to jump right to the email field and I put access key E and press control E, it would jump right to that field. I wouldn't have to tab to it, it would just go right there. Right? If I'm in a browser though, my gut tells me that if I do control E, something else happens. Because I know this, right? What happened? It brings up Google to search. Okay, so control E is not one you want to use. So really in general, I tell people, if you're writing an operating system native application, something that runs inside of Windows or the Mac OS, do it, you know? And then usually you'll do like control S, control X, control C, you know, all the common ones. But when you do a web application, I'm really, really careful with this and generally advise avoiding it because usually you don't find keys that are available to do that. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to learn how to style our forms a little bit, and I've already kind of been doing that along the way, but I want to just give you guys a little bit more to work with. So let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back, we'll do a little bit of styling, and then we're going to try to wrap up this chapter here and move on to the next one. All right, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this CSS piece, but I think I already demonstrated to you, for example, like how I took that submit button and just styled it up a little bit. And I'm going to tell you what I would do really quickly to improve my form is a couple of things. The first thing I would do is I would style it so that it kind of stands out from the rest of the page. So the first thing I would do is I would actually apply to the whole form element. I'd probably start with a little bit of padding, if I can type it right, just to give it a little bit of space around the edges. I'm also going to define a border for it, and I'm going to kind of stick with some real basic settings, and I don't know, that seems pretty good to me. I'm also going to go with a border radius, and yes, I'm just going to copy it from here, but I'm going to make it a little bit of a larger radius. Let's go with 13 pixels. I'm also going to give it a background color, probably not dark green. In fact, you know, maybe it would be good if it was just, I'm just thinking maybe like white would be fine in this, or how about white smoke, since it's an option. I didn't know that's an option, but there we go, white smoke. Let's go back and just quickly take a look at the monster I created here. All right, so now I got like a box. Yeah, that's not too bad, right? Looks like something. It's a little wide, honestly. So I might actually come in here and throw in like width, and I don't know, maybe it should just be 80% of the space that's available. And since we're doing that, let's go ahead and text align it to the center so it sits in the center of the screen. Kind of the same technique we use with the wrapper. Well, hey, no, right? You guys with me? No. Because what did it do? It didn't do what I anticipated. And this is really kind of a good demonstration, because we might want that box to sit in the center, but this is not how to do it. I didn't want my text to sit in the center. That looks horrible. Agreed? Yeah, I hope you guys agree. I think that looks horrible. So that's a big no right there. So let's get rid of that. That would align the text inside of it. What I want to do is I want to center the whole object, and the way that I do that is using this trick. I do margin 0, auto. And this is a trick that you learn over time, and I'm just kind of sharing it with you guys right off the bat. So that puts the form in the middle, but leaves the stuff inside of it the way it was. That looks better to me, doesn't it? All right. The other thing that might actually work kind of nice here is actually a box shadow. And I'm just going to do, once again, some really basic settings. Now watch the box as I refresh it on the screen. And I'm going to go to the bottom of the box to do the refresh. See the shadow? See how it makes it pop out from the page a little bit? I'll tell you what, if you don't like that look, if you want the shadow to be more even, what a lot of people do is it XY offset? I think that's what it is. Horizontal, vertical offset, blur radius. We'll leave the blur radius, maybe increase that to 8. This will make the shadow go evenly around the box. I don't know if you guys can even see it. Let's actually bump this up to like 11. Do a refresh. I don't know if you guys can even see the shadow on it. Just makes it look like it's coming forward a little bit. I would actually probably up that to maybe 15. Now it's a little more pronounced. You see it? You can say you don't, that's fine. If you ever look really closely at your operating system, so if I bring any screen on here, all the boxes in Windows and on the Mac OS have a little bit of a shadow. Really hard to see on those TVs, much more pronounced on your own screen. And they do it for the same reason. It makes it look like it's coming out of the page a little bit, like you should give attention to it. That's the whole point. Right, so that's just a little bit of basic CSS. You know, the other thing that I think is not looking too good inside there are those input boxes. I think all of them look hideous. So I'm going to style those. Once again, I'm going to add some padding to it. And I'm going to go kind of big on this. I think 12 pixels is probably a lot. It's going to add a little space inside of all the boxes. All the boxes are going to have a little bit of space. The other thing I think would look good is if they actually have a border, I'm going to go with a really thin border of 1 pixel. Once again, I like solid lines on borders, and I'm going to go with something not too dark and not too light. Like, I don't know if there's like a dark gray. Let's see if that works. Maybe not. All right, color picker. Here, I can create a dark gray right there. Let's go with the RGBA format. Oops. All right. You know what? Border radius would probably look pretty good on those too. Why do the input boxes have to be boring, right? Let's make those border radii 12 pixels. All right, let's go see the monster we've created. Whoa. Okay, maybe not the prettiest thing in the world, but you know what? Not too bad. Not too bad. I think that those boxes would look better if the background color here was something different. I don't know how you guys feel about that. I might say that dark gray is maybe too gray. I don't know if they allow me to change this. So let's go 99. Did I save? Refresh. Not that you guys can tell, but I did change it a little bit. All right, let's change the background color of the main box to something not quite so white. We'll put it in the gray range. Maybe we'll move into the yellows or something, or maybe it can even be in the blue range a little bit. Just to create a little bit of contrast. So let's refresh. All right, a little better. See where I'm going with it now? Another thing that a lot of modern designers are doing on their forms is this. There's an additional form element tag that they haven't demonstrated yet, and they might later. So you might opt to do something like this. So for, let's say last name might be a good spot to do it. Some people, instead of doing this, and you see how I'm commenting it out, using a label to label a field, instead they're using this other attribute called placeholder and putting their information inside the box like this. So instead of the name being here, watch now. Interesting, right? In fact, that looks like, if I go to Facebook, that's what they do in their boxes, isn't it? Yeah, they're using placeholders instead of labels. And I think that's a more modern approach, frankly, and I think it looks better. So I'm kind of demonstrating techniques here. This one's a label, that's plain text, this is a placeholder. You pick whichever one you think looks best. Of course, as soon as I go to click here and type, that just goes away. Where the value one, I got to get rid of it to make it go away. All right. And I'll tell you what, you play with those settings for CSS to your heart's content, and you will find a way that works for you. But try to make it look better than just a plain HTML form. Doesn't have to be particularly fancy, but it also doesn't take a lot to make it look kind of cool without, a significant amount of effort. It's just kind of like, if you're looking for ideas, go look at websites that you go to that you think look nice. And then look at it and go, what makes it look nice? What is it that works about this that doesn't work with mine? That's a good way to approach it. All right, so let's say that we get past this point where we finally have designed our forms and we are looking at, the forms actually processing on the server. What will typically happen is this. When you go and you open up your browser and you load a page, it goes to the server and requests the page. The server says, yeah, sure, here's the file, put it in your browser, right? When we fill out a form and hit the submit button, though, we're expecting a little bit more. Right? We're expecting that information that we're sending is somehow used, and that will be processed typically by some sort of a program on the server. And that program can be written in many different languages, folks. The first ones that you will learn in the web program will be JavaScript, because you can run JavaScript server-side with a technology called Node.js and the Express Package Manager that goes with it. Another technology that you'll learn right off the bat in your second semester will be PHP. And PHP is a server-side programming language that can intermingle with HTML like JavaScript does and do whatever it does. Interact with databases, write files, process programs, whatever. But that's a pretty important thing. The thing called the Common Gateway Interface is the way that we send the stuff to the server. What the server does on the back end just depends on what programs we've written on the server side. The programs that are written on the server side are done are often called server-side scripting, but they're really server-side programs, folks. And some of the languages that you can use are the ones that you see listed here. These are some common ones. I'm going to tell you that that list, I think, is a little bit antiquated at this point, because really people are not really using ASP that much anymore, straight old school ASP. But they are using ASP.NET quite a bit. And the back-end language there is actually C#. Typically, it can be Visual Basic as well. PHP is really common with open source applications. It's an open source language. You can do a lot of stuff server side with Java as well. One of the server side old school Java tools is JSP, but there's now 2 or 3 other newer formats that people actually prefer to use. Then there's some older technologies like Cold Fusion. The truth is, it doesn't really matter what the back-end language is, as long as it can receive what you're sending, process, and then send you something back to the browser. The big move lately has been, though, that JavaScript is becoming a huge server-side language, where in the past it was strictly a client-side language that only operated in your browser. So when they came out with this technology called Node.js, where they allowed JavaScript to run on the server, and then allowed programmers, web programmers like us who already knew JavaScript, to write server-side code without learning a new language. That was pretty huge. And subsequently, when we think of like a full-stack web developer, the server-side language they predominantly learn, hint, 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 is JavaScript using Node.js. It's kind of like the big movement out there. I wouldn't call it the primary back-end language, though, because really you can use just about anything as a back-end language. It's all a matter of how you send it the information and what it does with it in the aftermath. There are a lot of other server-side languages, though. So, for example, 10 years ago, it was really huge, was Ruby on Rails. You guys maybe even heard about that technology. We used to teach it here at Gateway. We just retired it a couple years ago. And that's a different programming language with a different framework and a whole different set of tools to learn. But that language did operate server-side and allowed you to do a lot of things really quickly and easily that otherwise you couldn't do. Form processing being just one aspect of it. Interacting with databases being another aspect. So these server-side skills, folks, you need to be aware of them at this point. But you don't learn these until later classes. When you get to the tail end of the program, it's all about server-side. We just kind of assume you got your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript under your belt. You understand how to do front end. Let's focus on the back end now, and then you'll start doing like heavier programming with like databases connecting to your web applications, and how the server-side stuff is driving like content management systems and other more advanced features. It's a fascinating area to get into, but this is coming down the road for you. The problem with what we have now is we can't really process our forms correctly, but when you do actually do that, this is kind of the techniques or the steps that happen, and you can read the bullets for yourself. What we're doing right now is we're kind of simulating the process. So when we created our thank you page, we are bopping people to a different page, and to them it appears like, okay, something happened on the back end, but the truth is nothing happened on the back end. If we were really doing it properly, we would send the information to the server would process it, and it would send us either a result page or an error page that would then give us the next page on the screen. The server would handle that, not us. So if we would send it to like a PHP script, that PHP script would take the user info, put it in a database, and if successful, then generate an HTML page that said, thank you very much. And then the file extension in the browser at the top would not be .html, it would be .php. Very interesting. All right. So what do you do with databases? You do searches, place orders, send web pages to a friend, subscribe to a newsletter like in our contact form, right? Those are the kind of things that you do. They do mention, though, when you are actually sending stuff to a server. So if I'm sending stuff to a PHP script, sometimes I need, and I'm going to say in some cases you must switch your method to post to make it work, because like a PHP script, for example, will not read a get. Isn't that interesting, right? So you'll find yourself switching your method to post, and then you can actually process it. Here's what's kind of interesting. That URL that they have on the screen right now does actually work. So the author of this book has set up a website with a script that actually reads your stuff in and puts it back up on the screen for you. If you want to experiment with that, feel free. Not part of the requirement for your assignment, but fun to play with because you can actually attach to a real server that will spit back your information. It's nothing particularly fancy, but like when you first learn to process forms in PHP class, that's exactly the kind of stuff you're going to do. You're just going to read it in and put it back on the screen. You'll do the same thing with JavaScript. Right. There is, a collection of websites out there that will gladly read in your form info and then give you response pages and even database your stuff and all that. And here's kind of a quick list. I haven't checked this list in a long time. I'm not a fan, and I'll just tell you that right up off the bat. But if you're really inclined to make that form actually do something rather than just give a thank you page, you might want to consider checking out these sites. I think it's easier to just use the author's link here because there's no commercial intervention of any sort. They're not trying to sell you anything, right? Where all these services somehow or another are trying to sell you something. So just keep that in mind. Some of the technologies that run server side. So here's links to the product. I don't know if these links are up to date, but like I said with Java, top link, Java server pages are kind of like the old school approach. We have two newer techniques that we use predominantly. One is called servlets or Java beans, and the other one is called Java server faces. Both considered more modern alternatives, although a lot of old schoolers still really dig JSP because you can intermingle it with your HTML. Cold Fusion's an old Adobe product. It is still used, although it's really lost favor. Ruby on Rails is kind of seemingly going the same way, although there's a lot of people that are huge fans of that framework, especially for doing open source work because there's some real elegant shortcuts that you can do with it. The one that's really kind of seemingly on an upward swing right now is the .NET framework, especially in what we call the enterprise in big organizations where they run their whole organization around Microsoft products. So they have Microsoft email, they have Microsoft databases, they build all their applications on top of .NET, and then they build their web applications on top of .NET too. But that does require Windows servers platforms in order to run the web pages, and they're a little bit different than some of the other technologies. A lot of the other technologies, like PHP, for example, it's what we call an interpreted language, which means it doesn't compile on the server, it just executes. JavaScript is the same way, JSP is the same way, Ruby is the same way. It doesn't compile to machine code before it runs. The difference with Microsoft's .NET framework is that it actually does compile. That means it turns into executable Windows files on the server, so when you're sending stuff to the server for processing, it's interacting with an executable, not an interpreted code. The advantage to that, of course, is if it's written well, it's really, really fast because it's pre-compiled. It doesn't have to pre-generate the instructions and run them. It's already generated. It can be really, really fast. Enterprise uses that a lot, once again, because of all their other infrastructure already being all Microsoft. In the open source world, the open web, PHP is really kind of king. It has been for a long time. Although we are seeing that a lot of big companies, once again I'll say enterprise, is kind of moving away from PHP development because some people think it's easier to hack. I don't necessarily agree with that. A lot of big applications, Facebook is a great example, was originally written on PHP. I don't know what they use now. But the technologies that you learned in your first PHP class, PHP tied to a MySQL database, that's what created Facebook. That's pretty powerful. Nothing really fancy. The guy wrote it while he was in school, right? We don't need to say his name. You guys know who he is, right? As kind of like, let's try this on, let's try this out. So he just had a website that interacted with the database, and then it kind of, turned into a monster that it is now. All right. Let's go back to do a little coding here. And I do want to mention that here I thought I was going to get through 2 chapters today. That's clearly not going to happen, right? And I don't want to like short sight the multimedia stuff, so I'm going to spend a little more time on the form stuff here so we have a really complete view of this. I also changed the due dates on the multimedia assignments, so the chapter 11 case study, because 9 and 11 go together, and then the multimedia assignment were pushed back a week for due dates. Doesn't mean that you can't read ahead and work on it though. All right, so let's go back to working a little bit on our form and talk about a couple of special types of modern developments in HTML5 forms. And you see the authors at the top there, HTML5 email text box. Now, I thought we already did one of those. We did, folks, right? We did create a form field for email, right? But notice it's still of type text, right? So when they wrote HTML5, somebody says, well, why don't, we created a type password, right? So it hides your characters when you type. Why don't we create one of type email? And the best way to show you what this means is to actually update the page, refresh it, and just type something in. So I'm going to go ahead and type, look, that's my email. They'll never know it's not real, right? So I go to hit submit, and what does it do? Basically what that box that just popped up is what we call a validation box. In the old days of HTML, like when I was learning it, we would have to write JavaScript code to check and see if the information that we're putting in the form was correct. So I'd have to write JavaScript that would say, well, there's got to be an @ sign in there, and there's got to be some text before the @ sign, some text after the @ sign, and then a dot, and then a few more letters. And what this does is it automatically kind of checks that for you. It's telling me, please enter, it's saying it's incomplete. Well, I can just enter a few more letters, right? Well, yeah, that it took. Okay. But now it has to be in an email format with an @ sign in order for it to work. Another thing that they added to HTML5, huge help, by the way, for those of us that have to code and used to have to write all those extra JavaScript things. So this, right, if they're signing up for our email list, I would say that this is required, right? So you can actually just type the word required into the field, and the user can't leave the page without filling that in. So if they're signing up for the mailing list, I think an email is kind of important, right? Yeah, for sure, because how are you going to email them otherwise? And also, if they're setting up an account like the password field, you probably want to make the password field required, right? And I would argue maybe name too, but whatever. Let's just put those in for now and then show you how that works. So I can like type my stuff in, right? Put in my, I don't know, let's I'll put in a thing. I'll put in the one password. I'll forget the second one. Oh, but it worked. I must not have saved it. I must not have reloaded it. All right, let's go back. Let's do a reload. Now let's try that again. Let's hit the thing. Nope. So it takes me right back to the password field and asks me to fill it out. All right, let's do it again. Right, I got to do the confirm password field too. And then if I wanted to make sure they were the same password, I'd have to write JavaScript for it, but we can just pretend for now. All right, So that required attribute is a really handy one. We used to have to write JavaScript, folks, just to do that and to create an error message. HTML5, they got Wise and they just added that in, so we don't have to write that. Some other special types too. So they have one for telephone, for example. So if I switch the type to tel, then it makes sure that it fits a phone number format. I'm not going to demonstrate that one, but feel free to try it. All right. The other thing that they have that's kind of cool is they have one for search. The search one creates a text box, but it puts into it, inside the box, a little magnifying glass, right? That you can click to initiate searches. Now, our form's not going to be used for that, but if you're creating a website where you might have a search feature, that's going to be pretty handy. Because it shows the user right off the bat that it's a search field. And it's really easy because everybody identifies that magnifying glass with searching. Another thing that's kind of interesting, a bunch of, once again, brand new HTML5 features. I'm not going to demonstrate all these, but you can see on the screen exactly what they do. So they go through, they create a label, they create the input of type text, right? Where you can put in a bunch of stuff, but it will also allow you to do this. You can have a data list of options already listed, and then that list, as you type, narrows down and brings in your selection. Isn't that cool? Doesn't that seem like, I mean, like when I'm like even inside of Dreamweaver pulling up form fields, it automatically is pulling those in. How does it do that? Well, it does it with the technology just like this. This is just as easy as the select option list, except it relates to a text box and automatically pulls in this list of colors by just adding this little attribute, list colors, and it pulls it in. So think about that when next time you're using, I don't know, something like Google, and Google auto types for you. How does it do that? That's kind of mind-boggling because they don't have a little list like this, right? They have something a lot more complicated running it. But here's a way that you can kind of create a similar thing. So if you wanted to, like, favorite color, and then you had a list of 20 favorite colors already in there, and they start typing, it will pop up the list. They can then see the one that they meant to type, click it, and pull it in. Really cool. Very, very cool. That's called a data list control. They also have a slider control. I think this is kind of neat too. So look at how this one works. All right. So once again, they're putting in a label, giving it some text, choose a number between 1 and 100, right? And then they put in a little more text that's going to wrap the slider. So the slider is just a little slide bar here. So that's the text before and the text after. Notice they have a space here so it doesn't touch. So the input type is of type range. You can set a low and a high value, and then you can move that slider. And as you move the slider from one to the other, depending on where they leave it, so if they leave it in the middle, it'll be what? 50, because it starts at 100 and ends, or starts at 1 and ends at 100. But if it was like 1 to 1,000 and it was in the middle, it'd be 500. And you can use the value that comes off the slider to feed into, once again, a server-side application that would actually read it and determine it, by using that little mechanism. I think that's fascinating too, that they've added that as a control inside of HTML5. They also have this thing they call the spinner control. And notice how this one works. So input type, and this one is number. And then once again, you set a min and a max. And then you have one of these where you have a up and down box. See that? So you can choose a numeric value within that range by clicking the up and the down arrows, and you can pick whatever value you want. I think that's really cool too. Another modern control in HTML5. Oh my gosh, you can put a count. So you ever guys like go to like a web page and like choose the date you want to sign up or whatever, and you click on the thing and the calendar pops up, and you're like, wow, these guys are master coders. Wrong answer. They're just using this brand new HTML5 thing where they just take an input type and call it date, and it gives you one of those boxes. That one's so easy to do, I think we should do it. What do you think? Yeah, let's do it, because it's so easy. All right. I don't know, maybe after password here, we could say your date of birth. Give it a line break. Let's do input, type. Wow, there's date time too. Yeah, you can choose date time. Date time, of course, adds clock aspects to it, but we're just going to choose date. We should give it a name. Name equals, I don't know, date. Or actually, it should be like DOB, right? ID equals DOB. And then we'll put a couple more line breaks here. Let's save that. Let's go back to the browser, go to the contact form. See, all right, your date of birth, click in the box. You can type, right? You can type your stuff in if you wish. Or better yet, you can just bring up the interface. Yeah, date of birth. It's going to take me a long time to scroll back to my date of birth, I can tell you that. But it's so cool. I mean, you can just choose a date and it just pops it right in. Looks like magic. You know what? It's just built in, folks. Once again, we used to have to run special tools to do this. Before HTML5 came out, they had jQuery libraries that pulled in calendars. And that's the one people were using for a while. Prior to that, it was not that you couldn't do it, it was just a pain. It was a huge pain. This is just built into HTML5. You guys have it so easy. Look how beautiful it looks, too. How well it works, you know, it's the other part of it. What about, like, when you pick a color? Well, guess what? This one's really easy to do, too. Let's do this one. We can just say your favorite color. Spelled correctly. All you have to do is change the type to what? Color. And I suppose we should call it fave color. Fave color. Saved it. Back to the browser. Do a refresh. What's your favorite color? Boom, you got a color picker. Yeah, right. I mean, that's exactly it. Wow. I mean, what did I do to make this happen? Nothing. All I'm doing is triggering what we call internal APIs, programming interfaces, that bring up this interface automatically. Depending on what system you're working on, it's going to bring up the default color palette for whatever your platform is. I saw the Windows one just now. If you do Mac, it'll bring up the Mac one, right? All right, so just to, yeah, it definitely, it's a wow. You know, the thing that you should do is also, when you guys create these, test them in different browsers. And what you're going to find that's really interesting is that if you're on a Mac, the form fields look different than on a PC. And if you're in Chrome, they look a little different than they look in Firefox, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Every browser produces form elements in a slightly different way, and every operating system also does the same thing. So it really takes a lot of testing to make sure that it looks good across all of it. That takes practice, basically. Now, this is, your first assignment in this unit is to add a form to your website. My no-brainer is create a contact page and put a contact form or a newsletter page or something like that on your website. The requirements for the assignment are, relatively simplistic when I think about it. I thought I was logged in, but I guess not. Maybe it timed out. We are in Unit 7. So, you need to add a form to your site. So they say create an additional page for it. Add a form that includes at least 8 form items. But I would like you to try to experiment with as many of them as you can that make sense for what you're doing. If you're signing somebody up for an email list, really all you need is like their name and their email address, but that's not going to give you 8 form fields. You see what I mean? So like I put in like password, check boxes. You can, folks, I'm going to post my code up to Apollo. You can always borrow from what I did, but you can also go out to websites that have forms, right-click, view source, and take a look. What did they do? Why not, right? There's lots of good form examples out there. And then I do want you to also make sure that you try styling it a little bit, even if it's something as, as primitive as what I have here. But you see, it doesn't take that much, really, to create something that looks okay. If I were to structure this, professionally, I would probably go with this look, like what I did for last name. I like that the best, right? And I would try to not have the user have to scroll down this far to find the button, but it's not that bad, I guess. Like, I might actually decide that I could maybe even set up a table or some columns and rows inside my form and put the stuff more towards the top of the screen. You play with it a little bit and see what looks good to you. Like maybe first name and last name can be on the same line if it's laid out nicely, right? You could go first name, middle initial, last name, and then like address, city, state, or whatever. You can put in any of that stuff that you want. If you did like a state field, you might want to do a drop down that has all 50 states in it. Maybe Puerto Rico and whatever, Guam or something in there too, right? So that would be a way that you can experiment. But I'd like you to try to experiment with as much of this stuff as you can. This is not really critical for your development now, but when you get to your subsequent classes, when you start to write server-side stuff, most server-side stuff is the result of interacting with the form. That's just how it is. Button presses, text fields, drop-down boxes, check boxes, that's just how it's done. Experiment and have fun with it. And that wraps the chapter, folks. So there's a lot to absorb there, right? So I'm glad I didn't try to squeeze that extra chapter in. Next week when we get together, we will work on multimedia. That will go pretty quick. So this is what I'm thinking for next week. I pushed back the due dates on the Chapter 9 and 11 case studies and the multimedia assignment. We'll lecture on multimedia, and then we'll use the rest of the day next week to work in class on anything that you guys need to work on, both as a group and individually. And so like if you have stuff that you're stuck on now or want more clarification on, or you want more examples or whatever it is you want, we can take that time and really kind of ramp up on it a little bit. I'm also kind of thinking of it as a little bit of a gasp where you guys are getting a breath to kind of get caught up. I don't know if you're catching this in the course shell, but we only have a couple units left after this, which means Thanksgiving is pretty much upon us, and then you're going to be kind of wrapping things up towards your final project. All right. I'm going to terminate the video here, and I'll see y'all in videos next week.